As the courtroom settles, your support truly helps. Subscribe, tap the like button, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from.
I remember the first thing he looked at wasn't me, or the seal over my head, or the people in the courtroom. It was the clock. The door opened quietly, and he stepped in like a man walking into a hotel lobby he'd visited 100 times. Nice suit, mid-40s, everything about him put together, just enough to say he took care of himself and expected the world to do the same. But his eyes went straight past the bench, straight past the officer, and landed on that old wall clock we'd had for years. He checked the time, not once, but twice. And I thought, we aren't going to be talking about parking today. It was an ordinary morning in municipal court. A couple of folks with crumpled tickets in their pockets, an older woman with a cane, a man in work boots still dusty from some job site. Papers rustled, a chair creaked here and there, the soft hum of people waiting their turn. Nothing dramatic. These are the days when you expect routine. You could hear the second hand of that clock ticking if you listened for it. I always did. It kept the rhythm of the room. I had my file in front of me, parking violation, disabled space, pharmacy lot, simple words, simple ink. He walked down the aisle slowly, not because he was unsure where to go, but as if he was evaluating the place. His gaze skimmed across the gallery, the way some people glance at a menu, quickly, with a quiet judgment about what was in front of them. When he reached the front, he sat before I invited him to. Leaned back, crossed one leg over the other. His fingers began to tap on the arm of the chair. Not nervously, impatiently. Every few seconds he glanced back up at the clock, then at his folder, then at the floor. He didn't look at the people behind him once. To him, they were scenery. In all my years on the bench, I've learned to listen to how people behave before they ever open their mouths. His posture said, "Let's get this over with." His eyes said, "My time costs more than yours." His presence said, "I'm used to things moving when I arrive." He hadn't even been called yet. I watched his jaw. There was a tightness there, a little muscle that tensed and released near his ear. His legs started to move, a small, repetitive bounce at the knee. If you didn't pay attention, you'd call it relaxed confidence. But I've seen real calm. Real calm doesn't fidget with the watch band or tap out invisible rhythms on cheap courtroom furniture. This wasn't calm. This was a man who didn't know how to wait. My clerk read his name, and he didn't stand right away. He let a beat pass, then another, as if to make the room wait on him. Only then did he get up and move toward the podium, checking the clock one more time on the way. "Good morning," I said. He answered politely enough, but there was a smoothness in his tone that carried no real respect, only habit, the kind of courtesy you give to a waiter or a receptionist, someone paid to keep you comfortable. And sitting there, listening to that first exchange, I thought to myself, I hadn't heard a single explanation yet. But his character was already laid out on the table in front of me. I opened the folder in front of me while he adjusted his cufflink like a man preparing for a meeting, not a hearing. On the cover, the charge was simple enough, parking violation. But the location told a different story. He hadn't stopped in a loading zone or at a fire hydrant. He'd left his luxury car in a handicapped spot in front of a small neighborhood pharmacy in the middle of a weekday afternoon. No placard, no permit, no emergency. On paper, the language was dry. Vehicle observed parked in restricted space, no visible authorization, no adjectives, no emotion, just fact. But I know those spaces. They aren't drawn on the pavement for decoration. They are, for many people, the difference between managing their lives with dignity and being shut out entirely. That pharmacy sits in an older part of the city. Narrow sidewalks, uneven curbs, worn awnings over the windows. Folks who go there often aren't feeling well. Some walk with canes. Some come by wheelchair. For many of them, that reserved spot is the only way they can get close enough to the door to manage the short walk inside. My father used to say, "You can tell who the strong are by whether they make room for the weak." I thought about that as I turned the page. This wasn't his first time on that block. The computer printout showed a pattern that jumped off the page even before I studied it. Earlier tickets, same general area. Twice for blocking access ramp, once for stopping in loading area marked for medical transport. The fines had all been paid eventually, not promptly, not apologetically, late with appeals attached. I scanned those appeals. The wording was almost identical each time. Minor inconvenience. Only a short stop. Circumstances did not warrant such a strict response. When different incidents start using the same language, you're not looking at a mistake anymore. You're looking at a philosophy. He shifted his way to the podium while I read. Not nervous, exactly. More like a man who finds this whole exercise beneath his schedule. When I mentioned the location, designated parking for disabled patrons, I caught a tiny change in his face. Not remorse, a shadow of irritation, quickly buried. I was only there a moment, he said smoothly. There were no other options. His voice was calm, his words carefully chosen, but there was a faint, almost amused curve at the corner of his mouth when he spoke about no other options, as if the very idea of being limited by painted lines on asphalt was mildly absurd. I'd been doing this long enough to recognize that kind of ease. That's not the voice of someone losing sleep over a ticket. That's someone who has grown used to the idea that problems can be handled with the right call, the right check, the right connection. Earlier, when my clerk mentioned the possibility of an increased fine, I'd seen it, a very slight smile, there and gone in an instant. Not happiness, familiarity. The look of a man who has paid for inconveniences before and expects to do so again. But as soon as I began the formal part of the proceedings, stating the case number, reading the charge into the record, his demeanor shifted. The casual posture tightened. His answers became shorter, more precise. Yes, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. Correct, Your Honor. The words were respectful, but the respect lived in the syllables, not yet in the heart. Still, his eyes moved from the clock to me, to the file in my hand. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't a quick desk he could sign something at and walk away. I could almost feel the calculation happening behind his gaze, weighing the cost of his time against the possibility that this morning would not end with a signature and a shrug. So I closed the file gently, laid my hand on it, and looked directly at him. Out loud, I said nothing more than what the law required. Inside, another thought formed very clearly. This wasn't going to be about a blue-painted rectangle on the ground. It was going to be about what he believed that rectangle meant and who he believed it was for. And from that point on, the facts in the record began to speak louder than anything he could say. I asked him to explain, in his own words, why he had parked there. He didn't hesitate. It was a minute, he said, maybe two. People exaggerate these things. That answer floated in the air like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. So I pulled it gently but firmly. I read the timestamp from the officer's citation and the timestamp from the second photo, 9 minutes apart. Same position, same violation, same car, unmoved. The shift in the room was small but unmistakable. A woman in the back straightened in her seat. Someone exhaled softly through their nose. Even he paused just long enough for silence to slip between us. He kept his expression tight, but his hand betrayed him. He unfastened his watch, looked at it, then set it down beside his papers, as though the weight of time itself had become uncomfortable. His shoulders leaned forward, no longer reclining with the ease of a man evaluating service, but with the vigilance of someone bracing against an inquiry that might not go his way. In all my years, I thought, the moment a person stops leaning back is the moment the truth begins its climb out. I asked another question, simple and neutral. Did you see the sign? He blinked. A brief, involuntary flicker of uncertainty, gone before most would notice. But I've been watching eyes for decades. Of course I saw it, he said, then quickly added, But there are always cars there. Everyone uses that spot when it's busy. 2 sentences. 2 incompatible truths. He must have heard the contradiction himself, because he shifted again, this time adjusting his tie even though it hadn't moved. The muscles along his jaw tightened. That's where fear hides in people who consider themselves fearless, in the places they believe no one is watching. Before I could ask the next question, the officer stepped forward a half step, not aggressively, but with the calm certainty of someone who has nothing to hide. "Your Honor, I approached him twice," he said evenly. "Both times he told me, 'I'm not blocking anyone, just write the ticket.'" The room grew still. Not hostile, just aware. I looked back at the man. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. He wasn't used to having his past words repeated verbatim in a room where he couldn't control the narrative. His fingers began drumming on the podium, soft, restless taps, a rhythm of someone trying to keep hold of a story that was slipping away, one fact at a time. "That's not exactly what I said," he muttered, but he didn't offer what he had said. That was the first real crack. I've learned that people don't always lie to deceive others. Sometimes they lie because the truth challenges the version of themselves they prefer. And this man preferred the version where he was reasonable, efficient, misunderstood anything but entitled. "Let's return to your statement," I said carefully. "You mentioned being there for a minute or two, yet the record shows otherwise. Can you help the court understand that difference?" For a moment, he didn't speak. His mouth opened, then closed again. The tapping stopped. Then came the sentence that shifted the temperature of the room. "I didn't think anyone who needed the spot would be there at that time." Not cruel, not shouted, just honest enough to reveal the parts of the truth he never intended to say out loud. It wasn't about time. It wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about assumption, his assumption that his need, his schedule, his errands outweighed the limitations of people he didn't see. When he said it, something in the room softened and hardened at the same time. People weren't angry. They were disappointed. And disappointment carries more weight in a courtroom than any raised voice. He realized his mistake the moment he heard himself. His posture collapsed slightly, almost imperceptibly, shoulders lowering, chin dropping half an inch. A man who had walked in with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed was now, for the first time that morning, facing himself instead of me. Inside, I thought, this is the hinge. Either he will confront the truth, or he will run from it. But before he could choose, he looked up and said one more thing, quieter, almost to himself. "Maybe I didn't think, because I never have to." And that was the moment the entire case changed. Not legally, morally, the room waited, holding its breath, and I knew that whatever happened next would break the story open completely. I went back to the record, not to press him, but to make sure there was no room left for confusion. I repeated the times, the photographs, the location. I reminded him and everyone listening that the space was clearly marked, that other spots in the lot had been opened farther away. It was all said in the same plain tone I use for any case. I've never believed in sharpening the knife just because someone has money. When I finished, he let out a long, annoyed sigh. Not the exhale of a man reflecting the exhale of someone trapped in a meeting he didn't schedule. Then he said it, not quite under his breath, just loud enough that the words carried across the benches. "This is exactly why people don't respect courts anymore." It wasn't a legal argument. It wasn't even a defense. It was contempt, wrapped in frustration, aimed not just at me, but at the idea that he should have to be there at all. The room froze, not in fear, in disbelief. A woman with a tote bag near the back stopped shifting in her seat. An older man in the second row lifted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. Even the officer's jaw set a little tighter. You could feel people thinking, if this is how he talks here, how must he act out there? Inside, I had a very clear thought. You can disagree with a ruling, you can dislike a law, but when you dismiss the process itself, you're really dismissing the people who live under it with you. I didn't answer right away. I've learned that rushing to fill a bad silence only gives it more power. So I let the quiet spread, Let him hear his own sentence echo off the old wood and plaster. Then, very deliberately, I set my pen down. That's a small gesture, I know, but everyone who spends enough time in my courtroom understands it. It means we're not just talking about forms and fines anymore. We're talking about something heavier. I folded my hands, looked straight at him, and said slowly, "Sir, this court exists so that everyone in this city, from the wealthiest to the poorest, from the strongest to the frailest, has the same set of rules. If you feel disrespected by that, we have a deeper problem than a parking ticket." My voice never rose. I didn't need it to. The steadiness did the work. For the first time since he'd walked in, he stopped glancing at the clock. His eyes locked on mine. The casual tilt of his shoulders disappeared. He straightened, not from pride this time, but from an instinct that told him the ground had shifted and he'd better stand up on it. The confidence he'd worn like a jacket when he entered the room no longer fit him quite so well. You could see the seams pulling. I asked him one question, not about the minutes or the photographs or even the sign. Do you believe the rules in this city are for you or only for the people behind you in this room? The words landed and just stayed there. He opened his mouth almost on reflex, ready to deliver the polished answer he probably used in boardrooms and community events. Then he stopped. Closed it again. Looked down at the podium as if the grain of the wood might offer him a script. The seconds stretched, but I didn't rescue him from them. His fingers, which had been beating out that impatient rhythm earlier, now lay flat. One hand slid over the other, squeezing tight. The man who had measured this morning in billable hours and meetings suddenly found himself in a kind of time you can't bill and can't skip. He tried once more. I think this is getting blown out of proportion," he started, but even he seemed to hear how small that sounded now. The sentence died on its own halfway through. He took a breath, sharper than he meant to, and for the first time I saw it clearly. He wasn't just wrestling with the court. He was wrestling with the possibility that, in this room at least, his status had no more weight than the ticket in my hand. In that quiet, I thought, this is the hinge. Either he steps through and accepts that he's one citizen among many, or he cracks under the realization that he isn't standing above anyone in here. For a moment, he looked like a man who had misplaced his own voice, and that, more than anything he had said so far, told me we were finally close to something real. I let the silence settle after his unfinished sentence. In all my years on the bench, I've learned that truth doesn't always arrive with volume. Sometimes it slips in quietly when a person has run out of places to hide. I turned to the officer and asked him, as plainly as I ask in any routine matter, "Please describe what you observed that day." He nodded, stepped a little forward, and kept his eyes on me, not on the man at the podium. There was no tension in his voice, no judgment, just a kind of steadiness that comes from doing the job, the same way whether someone is driving a beat-up sedan or a luxury SUV. "Judge," he said, "I approached the vehicle because it was parked in the handicap access spot. I explained that the space was reserved. He told me, 'Write the ticket. I can afford it.'" There was no reaction in his tone, but the room reacted for him. A few people shifted in their seats. One woman pressed her lips together, not angrily, but with that tired kind of disappointment older people get when life keeps confirming something they wish weren't true. The words themselves weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They landed with a weight that pushed the air down. I looked back at the man. He didn't meet my eye this time. His jaw tightened, but not in defiance, in regret. The kind you feel when you hear yourself quoted and suddenly realize you didn't sound the way you thought you did. He swallowed, then said quietly, "I didn't think anyone needed it at that moment." There was no arrogance in his voice now, just a tired honesty, the first we had heard all morning. His hands, which had been restless earlier, were still. His shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, as though he finally allowed himself to feel the weight behind the words. Inside, I thought, this wasn't cruelty. This was a blind spot, and blind spots are harder to admit than mistakes. Before I could speak, a soft voice rose from the benches. An older man, the one I'd noticed, leaning on a cane as he entered, cleared his throat gently. "Judge," he said, "some days that's the only spot I can manage. If it's taken, I have to go home without my medication." He wasn't accusing anyone. He wasn't giving a speech. He was simply telling the truth of his life, and the room treated it like something fragile. The defendant's eyes lifted, and for the first time since the hearing began, he truly looked at another person in the room. The older man didn't glare. He didn't even frown. He just offered a small nod, the kind people give when they're too tired to be angry. Something shifted then, not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough that I could feel the room breathe differently. The case stopped being about a spot and a fine. It became about the quiet, ordinary ways we inconvenience lives we don't see. I let the moment sit. Then I explained my ruling. "The law," I said, "isn't here to punish convenience. It's here to protect necessity. Those spaces exist for people who don't get to choose whether they can walk farther today." I announced the full fine, no reductions, no special considerations, not out of spite, out of fairness. And I explained it clearly, the same way I would to anyone. A violation that affects the vulnerable is not a small violation. He nodded before I even finished. Not the dismissive nod he carried in earlier, the kind a man gives when he finally understands why the answer can't be different. You could feel the room settle into agreement. Not triumph, not gloating, just the quiet alignment that comes when something lands exactly where it should. Inside, I found myself thinking of something my father told me long before I ever wore a robe. Justice isn't loud. It's the sound a room makes when everyone knows the truth. When I announced the decision, the room didn't erupt with reactions the way some might imagine justice looks. It rarely does. Real justice arrives quietly, like a tide, not a wave. And that morning was no exception. He stood there for a moment longer than I expected, his hands resting at his sides in a way that felt almost unfamiliar for a man who had spent the entire hearing gripping his own self-importance like a shield. He looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, and for the first time since he entered my courtroom, I saw a person instead of a performance. "Judge, I understand," he said softly. The words weren't perfect, but sincerity rarely is. They were enough. He stepped away from the podium, moving slower than when he'd marched in with that polished confidence. And as he made his way down the aisle, something subtle happened. The room exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow loosening of tension, the way a room relaxes when a storm cloud finally decides not to burst. The older gentleman with the cane watched him pass and gave a small nod, a gesture so modest that most people would have missed it. The defendant paused just briefly and returned the nod with something almost like humility. No words were exchanged, but sometimes words only get in the way. Respect, when it finally appears, speaks for itself. People began filing out quietly after that. Some glanced at me, some didn't. But there was a softness in the air, a sense that what happened wasn't about punishment, but about understanding, the kind that leaves a deeper imprint than any fine or lecture. Weeks later, in the middle of a long afternoon reviewing administrative records, I saw his name again. Just a line on the system, fine, paid on time. Nothing more. No supplementary notes, no disputes, no new violations. A simple act of compliance. But to me, it said more about a man's shift in character than a dozen apologies could. People don't send letters announcing that they've changed. They show it in the absence of what used to be. A few months after that, I was leaving the courtroom when the older gentleman, the one with the quiet dignity and steady cane, walked toward me. He wasn't there for any case that day. He just happened to be passing through the hallway. He stopped beside me, his voice gentle but firm, with the kind of conviction that comes only from a long life of watching people become better or not. "You handled that right, Judge," he said. No grand compliments, no speeches, just the truth of someone who understood exactly what had happened, not the legal outcome, but the human one. I thanked him, and he tapped his cane lightly against the floor before continuing on, moving with slow determination, the walk of someone who still believes small acts of fairness matter, even when the world seems too large to notice them. Later that evening, long after the courthouse emptied, I found myself thinking about that man with a luxury suit and restless hands, thinking about how he had walked in convinced that time and status were currency, and walked out realizing neither held value, in a courtroom built on equality. I thought about how, in the end, the lesson he needed wasn't fear or humiliation, but perspective. My father once told me, when I was still a boy, sweeping the floor of our family home, "Son, the law may show people the line, but character is what brings them back to it." Or I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now. Some cases stay with me not because of their difficulty, but because of their simplicity, a reminder that people don't break overnight, and they don't heal overnight either. They shift moment by moment, decision by decision, the way he did when he finally looked at the older man in the aisle and saw not an inconvenience, but a fellow human being. And that is why, after thousands of cases, this one still lingers in my memory. Because in that quiet transformation, barely visible, easy to overlook, I was reminded of something my father also used to say. Privilege may open doors, but only humility lets you walk through them.